a little longer than a few hours removed. How are you feeling about that one, knowing that you had a post game come off of an overtime loss they easily could have won?
Yeah, and see that's the thing that's so frustrating about today, more so than maybe some other games. Currently this team sits at 11-15, and as you just said, Layla, a game they easily should have won, and quite honestly, I mean, could have won, and easily a game they should have won. But now these should have won games are starting to add up, and you're starting to get a little concerned because we're only 26 games into this, and we sat down last night. We didn't discuss it during the post-game show, but we kind of were talking about it off air in between segments and after we got off the air. I mean, that's, 4 games probably now that they were supposed to win, that they should have won, that they didn't. And you heard Billy talk about it last night in his post-game comments. They just don't have that room for error that we thought they would going into the season in these type of games.
I thought you were great last night, Will, during the postgame show, late in the postgame show, when there was some real talk about the mentality of a big man. And you were sort of seeing it through the eyes of Nikola Vucevic about involvement and touches and how a team, and it wasn't necessarily old school stuff back in my day and the pivot man used to do this and that. It was talking about how to keep someone engaged and going when they've got it going.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Billy's still searching. He's changing the lineups. Guys are constantly in and out of the rotation. I don't think he's struggling, but what he's trying to do is find the best combination. And I think that's where he's having a problem as far as finding the best combination that's successful. But you've heard, again, Kendall and I have talked about it. Stacey's been talking about it. To give this team the best opportunity to win, I think you have to run the offense through Vooch. Now, I think people misunderstand when I say that about, well, he needs to touch the ball down the floor every single time. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the best offense, even in this day and age, much like it was back in the 80s and 90s, is to work the ball from inside out, side to side. You got to get the defense moving. You got to put pressure on the defense. Vooch is a willing passer, but he also, I think, identifies and has a really high basketball IQ, a good shot, a bad shot. But the part I think you're talking about, Dan, is if you really want, people keep hammering on Vooch about his defense. Vooch's defense sucks. He's not a good defensive player. He's average. And so is every other big man in this league because everything now is so perimeter-oriented. But what you have to do is find a way to get him more engaged on the defensive end. And how do you do that? It's just human nature. Get him touches. Put the ball in his hands. Let him make decisions. He said before the practice started, he needed to get more touches. He said as we entered after preseason going into the first game, we need more touches. But unfortunately, we keep finding him out on the perimeter a little too much, not in the post enough. And as you talked about, that affects. He won't admit it. I never admitted it when I played. But guys will tell you, if you want them to be more engaged on the defensive end, they need to be more engaged on the offensive end.
Well, if you're saying this, you can't be the only one. We've heard Billy Donovan talk very candidly about this team and what he thinks it needs and why certain breakdowns are happening. So at what point do you think it's on him and the coaching staff to try to make that possible?
Well, I said on the show, it's 2 things. One, Vooch has been in the league long enough. He's played in the All-Star games, plural. He needs to demand the basketball. And that means, like, Phil Jackson used to sit here and hammer home to Michael Jordan. We start off the game by passing it into the post. And I watched, during a timeout, Bill Cartwright put his finger in Michael's chest and say, throw the ball in the post. Run the offense. Phil kept hammering it home. Michael finally relented. Michael started trusting his teammates. Now we're talking about 6 championships later. Now, it wasn't just about that, but it's you have to sacrifice personal gain for team gain. And I think that's also the hard thing that these guys sometimes don't understand is when you talk about the bigger picture. If you want to be considered a better player, then your team needs to win. If you put up points and numbers on a losing team, what does everybody say? Well, how does he make his team better? His team doesn't win. So maybe score a few less points, maybe get a few less touches, be more engaged on the defensive end. But it's one of those things. We keep hearing the same things now that we heard last year. So at what point now do we have to make some drastic changes, and those drastic changes fall in the lap of Billy and the coaching staff?
Well, and also those above them who might be able to find a way to improve this roster. They need shooting, depth shooting that all these other teams have. Every team the Bulls play, there's some guy off the bench. It seems like their 8th guy knocking down threes, right? And they need somebody who obviously can protect the rim. I don't think that's necessarily the same person. But I'm just wondering, what is it another big, or is it a real rotation, like 3-and-D guy that they could tweak, tinker around with to make, instead of Derek Jones, somebody who's just a better all-around, more trustworthy player than Derek Jones? You know what I mean? Like they could get better marginally at a couple spots that would really make them significantly better.
Well, I think there's 2 things, Dan, honestly. I mean, one, as you just pointed out, the Bulls shot 26% from 3 last night, 7 of 27. It wasn't like the Hawks shot much better. I mean, they shot 33%, but 13 out of 39. So they made 6 more threes. That was pretty much the difference in the game because the Bulls won the rebounding battle and the turnover, blah, blah, look at all. If you want to look at just stats alone, that's the one thing that jumps out at you. But I've continued to talk about this, and I'm not sure people understand the effect of chemistry and what happens in the locker room. I want to know, because every team I played on, and every team, I was very fortunate to play on the teams I played on in Chicago and San Antonio. But also, every team had an agitator on that team, meaning somebody that holds everybody's feet to the fire in that locker room. Somebody that's willing to step up at the expense of them being liked, but they are respected, to talk to guys about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. Because, again, I will talk about, as we hear Billy talk about, this team has to play up to a standard, and this team needs to hold themselves accountable. And this team, it kind of goes back to Leila's question about, okay, is this more on the players? Is this more on the coaches? But we're hearing a lot of the same things, but we're 11 and 15. And I know, again, some people will say we're only 26 games in. Wait till Lonzo comes back. Is there anybody out there right now that can tell me and guarantee me that Lonzo's coming back?
No.
Absolutely not.
And to me, and this is just from a forward player standpoint, that's the issue. I think that these guys are just kind of, all right, let's maintain, let's hold on, don't let go of the rope. Lonzo gets back and everything will change, because in the short body of work that we have last year when this team was whole, they were very good. There is no question about that. But even then, you have to ask yourself, are they better than Milwaukee? Are they better than Boston? Are they better than Philly, even when they are whole? And I understand Arturis wanting to talk about, we need to see this team play a bigger we need to see a bigger set of games to prove whether this team can really compete or not. But honestly, I feel like we do have that answer. The question is, at what point are they willing and going to make changes? Because as you talked about, Dan, in the off season, they knew they had to address perimeter shooting, and they didn't do it. Now, what they did do was they made the bench much, 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 much better. But there's still holes in this team that need to be filled.
Well, and the reason they had to make the bench much better was, even though Dan took a vow to not talk about him, I'm not going to. So I know that those minutes that Goran Dragic is getting is a lot because of Lonzo's availability or lack thereof and what they anticipated in the offseason. So they had to address things that they thought were already settled. I think one of my concerns, though, isn't just that. It's that everything has to be working perfectly. Like, it's got to be, when we mention the bench, like Andre Drummond has to have like a wonderful night, or you have to have Vooch and DeMar and Zach LaVine's combined for 77 points. I'm not going to go into the 35 assist category. We're not talking about that. On Saturday, I know that happened. But you know what I'm saying when I say that even the bench pieces, because of this margin for error they have, it seems like everybody has to just play absolutely perfectly in order to get a win.
Well, and this is where I'll disagree with you a little bit. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but, you know, Dan, I really think that you know the game. You're intelligent. I love talking to you about basketball, but there's a couple words, two words that come to mind now that are at the top of my list. Like when I'm watching a game, something comes to mind and I write it down. Mm-hmm. I start questioning on this team compatibility and chemistry. I understand these guys get along wonderfully off the floor. That's great because it makes travel a lot easier. But I'm talking about from the time the game starts to the time the game ends, about the compatibility, about the chemistry. Something's off, because that's probably the most frustrating thing is this team has talent. This team should not be 11-15. This team should be playing much better consistently, but they're not for some reason. And I know there's been injuries, but everybody has injuries. Everybody has to deal with that. You have to plan on the unknown as far as coaches go, players go, et cetera. Something is just, you're not adding up. And what I wish I was in the locker room. I wish I was at practices. I wish I was on the plane so I could figure it out. Because when they trot this lineup out and you see Vooch and you see Zach and you see DeMar, and, you know, as you talked about, you see the bench had 42 points last night. You're like, this team is way too good to be 11-15. They should be better.